Hello again. If you are here, you are in the right place tonight. Find your spot, turn the lamp down low or off altogether if the dark already feels right to you. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders and let them drop an inch or two from wherever they have been sitting all day. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next little while, and nothing here that asks you to stay awake for it. If anything, the opposite is true. This is built for the leaving, for the slow slide out of your own evening and into somebody else's, 130 years gone. Tonight, we are not going anywhere grand. No battlefield, no palace, no courtroom. Just a narrow brownstone on a quiet street in Brooklyn in the autumn of 1894, where the rain has been falling since noon and will keep falling well past midnight, drumming softly on slate roofs and pooling in the gutters along the curb. Behind one particular door, a woman named Augusta Kendrick is standing at a coal range with flour dusted across her wrists, stretching 1.5 pounds of stewing beef into supper for 9 people on a household budget. Upstairs, in small rooms under the eaves, a handful of young clerks and seamstresses and schoolteachers who have no family left in this city to go home to are climbing the stairs toward the only place that currently counts as theirs. It is the kind of house you have probably pictured before without quite knowing it. Gaslight glowing through lace curtains, something roasting low and slow on the stove. A grandfather clock keeping unhurried time in a parlor where nobody, strangely, ever seems fully at ease. We're going to open that door tonight, hang up our coat in the front hall, and stay until the last lamp in the last room under that roof has gone dark and the house has settled all the way down into sleep. Get comfortable, friend. We have a long, quiet evening ahead of us, and I think you will like where it takes you. So, here is what we are actually doing tonight. We are going to follow one boarding house and the people who fill it through a single autumn day in 1894 from the moment Mrs. Kendrick's feet hit the cold floorboards before dawn to the moment the last gas jet in that house gets turned down to a blue pinprick and the whole street outside goes dark and quiet. If you ask most passers-by what a place like this looked like from the inside, you would probably get a version closer to a stage play than a household, a kindly landlady in a spotless apron. Boarders gather cheerfully around a groaning table, a house that runs itself on warmth and good manners, the way it does in the illustrations. That version is not wrong exactly. It is just missing almost everything that made the real thing exhausting and clever and worth understanding. The real version has a woman on her feet for 16 hours a day, hauling coal up 3 flights of stairs because there is no one else to haul it. It has a set of unspoken rules at the dinner table, stricter than most people would tolerate from an actual employer. It has young women living entirely alone in a city of over 1 million strangers, for the first time in the history of that city, in numbers nobody quite knew what to do with yet. And it has an economy running quietly underneath all of it, a ledger of pennies and pounds of meat and coal by the scuttle that decided whether that woman kept her house or lost it. We will meet all of these people properly before long. Augusta Kendrick herself first, then the boarders whose lives fold in and out of her own across the course of a single evening, a dry goods clerk still young enough to enjoy the sound of his own boots on wet pavement, a schoolteacher grading arithmetic by lamplight, a seamstress mending her own clothes after a full day spent mending other people's, piano teacher humming half-remembered scales to himself in the dark. None of them know each other from before this house. All of them will end tonight, as they end most nights, considerably more connected to one another than any of them quite admits out loud. Before we go any further, if the kind of evening we are building here suits you, If you would rather sink into a place you can actually stand inside than sit through another list of dates and names, would you take just a moment and subscribe? It costs you nothing, and it means more to the continuation of these evenings than you might guess. And if you are inclined, tell me in the comments what city you are in tonight and what the clock says where you are. I do read them, usually the next morning with coffee. Wherever you are, however late it has gotten, I am glad you are here with me. By the time we reach the end of tonight's evening, I think you will see a boarding house differently than you did an hour ago. Not as a quaint backdrop for a costume drama, but as one of the great overlooked machines of the 19th century city, a piece of infrastructure built almost entirely out of one woman's labor and other people's loneliness, holding up a city that had nowhere else to put all its clerks and seamstresses and schoolteachers. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. It is 5:30 in the morning, and somewhere above a rain-slaked Brooklyn street, a match is being struck against a cold kitchen range. It is October of 1894. Brooklyn is still, for a few more years yet, its own city separate from Manhattan, with its own mayor and its own newspapers, and nearly 1 million people crowded into it, more than live in most of the states out west. The Brooklyn Bridge has been standing for 11 years now, its cable slick with rain tonight, carrying men in bowler hats across the river toward offices they will not see again until after dark. Blossom Street runs 3 blocks back from the busier avenues in the part of Brooklyn Heights where the grand old merchant houses have started, quietly, to change hands and change purpose. A shipbuilder's widow sells her 4-story brownstone to a family who cannot afford to live in all of it themselves, and so they rent out the rooms they do not need, and the house becomes something new. Not a mansion anymore. Not quite a hotel, something in between, that this era has not yet settled on a tidy word for. The rain has been coming down since noon, the ordinary autumn kind, not a storm, just a steady grey soaking that darkens the brownstone facades to the color of wet chocolate and turns the cobblestones on the side streets into a slick, uneven mirror. Where the street has been paved over with asphalt, closer to the avenue, it holds puddles the shape of continents. Where it has not, the mud works its way up onto the wooden sidewalks and into the hems of every skirt in the neighborhood. Gas lamps stand at the corners, lit early tonight because of the weather, throwing soft cones of yellow light that the rain falls through in visible threads. The smell of the street changes block by block, the way it always does in this city. Down by the avenue there is coal smoke, thick and sulphurous, pouring from 1,000 chimneys at once, because nearly every building in Brooklyn heats itself the same way tonight. Closer to the docks, the wind carries brine and tar and the flat mineral sourness of the East River at low tide. On Blossom Street itself, the smell is gentler. Wet stone horse and leather from the hansom cabs working the corner. Somebody's coal fire, drawing well. And underneath all of it, from open basement windows up and down the road dinner, a dozen different suppers cooking at once, cabbage and onion and roasting meat. A whole street eating at more or less the same hour, because more or less everyone works the same hours. The sounds layer the same way the smells do. A horse car rattles past 2 streets over on iron rails, its bell clanging at the crossing. Somewhere, a vendor selling roasted chestnuts from a cart calls out into the rain, his voice going hoarse with the effort of competing against the weather. Church bells mark the half hour from 3 different steeples within earshot, never quite in agreement with one another about what time it actually is. Boot heels click and slap against wet pavement as clerks and shopgirls hurry the last blocks home from the trolley stop, umbrellas tilted against the wind, coat collars turned up. A dog barks twice from behind a fence and gives it up as not worth the effort in this weather. Walk 2 blocks in either direction from Blossom Street and the neighborhood changes its character entirely, the way Brooklyn neighborhoods tend to at this point in the century. Toward the harbor, the streets grow narrower and louder, tenement buildings packed close together, laundry strung between fire escapes even in this weather. A dozen languages carrying through open windows, Irish and German and increasingly Italian, the newest arrivals to a city that has been absorbing new arrivals for 2 centuries running. Toward the park, the houses widen and quiet down, ironwork gates and stone stoops, kept scrubbed by servants, nobody on the street ever quite sees at work. Blossom Street sits in the narrow, respectable middle ground between these 2 Brooklyns, close enough to the harbor that a clerk can walk to the ferry in 20 minutes. Genteel enough that a schoolmistress can give her mother's friends the address without embarrassment. This middle ground is precisely where the boarding house as an institution thrives, in the gap between a poverty too visible to disguise and a wealth too established to need borders at all. The season itself deserves a moment before we go any further. This is not the crisp postcard version of autumn that gets painted onto calendars. All gold leaves and clear light. This is the wetter, grayer version most of the northeastern seaboard actually experiences most years. A slow procession of overcast days interrupted by rain rather than by sun. The trees along the avenue dropping their leaves into puddles rather than crunching underfoot. It is the kind of autumn that settles into wood and wool and never quite leaves them, so that a coat hung by the door in October carries a faint dampness in it clear through to December, and a house has to work harder, burn more coal, dry more linens by the fire, simply to stay ahead of a season that shows no sign of hurrying toward its end. The brownstone itself has its own quiet history, though nobody currently living inside it thinks about it often. It was built in the early 1860s, during the years when this stretch of Brooklyn Heights was filling rapidly with exactly this kind of house, tall and narrow and faced in the same warm brown sandstone, hauled down by ship from quarries up the Connecticut River. A stone so ubiquitous across these blocks that an entire generation of New Yorkers would eventually use its name as shorthand for respectable middle-class housing itself. It was built for a single family, a merchant and his wife and their 5 children, with a full staff of servants living in rooms very much like the ones Augusta's boarders occupy now, though under an entirely different arrangement of ownership and obligation. That merchant is 3 decades gone, his family scattered or passed on, and the house has changed hands twice since, each time drifting a little further from its original purpose, until it arrived, by a route neither planned nor unusual, at the purpose it serves tonight. This is a city and a country in the middle of something. The economic panic that started the year before, in 1893, has not fully lifted. Banks failed. Factories closed or cut wages. Men who considered themselves solidly middle class a year ago are now counting nickels the way their fathers never had to. A young clerk starting out in a Manhattan dry goods house might earn $8 or $9 a week if he is fortunate. Perhaps less if his employer has used the hard times as an excuse to trim salaries, which more than a few have. A seamstress working piecework for a garment manufacturer earns considerably less than that, sometimes as little as $4 or $5 for a full week of 10 and 11-hour days, her eyes going soft and strained by the end of it. A loaf of bread costs about a nickel. A pound of the cheaper cuts of beef runs somewhere around 12 cents, less if you know which butcher sells off his unsold stock at the end of the day, which every good boarding housekeeper in this city absolutely does know. Room and board, the whole of it, meals included, in a respectable house in a respectable part of Brooklyn, runs somewhere between $4 and $6 a week depending on the floor, the the size of the room, and how much you are willing to share a hallway with strangers on your way to the water closet. Which means that a young man earning $8 a week is handing over more than half his income simply to have somewhere warm and legitimate to sleep and eat. And a young woman earning half of what he does is doing arithmetic considerably more painful than his. This is the arithmetic that built the boarding house as an institution. Not sentiment, necessity, dressed up afterward in lace curtains and a decent parlor rug. Let us walk down Blossom Street a little further, past the houses that have kept their original purpose, toward the one that has not. It sits mid-block, 4 stories, including the basement kitchen, brownstone front gone dark and glossy with rain, a short flight of stone steps rising to a black-painted door with a brass number plate that somebody evidently still polishes. A discreet card sits in the front parlor window, the kind that says everything and nothing at once. Boarders wanted. Respectable house. Inquire within. Behind that door, at this hour, only one person in the entire building is awake. Her name is Augusta Kendrick, and she is 54 years old, and she has kept this house, in one form or another, for the better part of 11 years. She did not set out to become a landlady. Very few women of her generation did, in the sense of it being a plan, a career chosen from a list of careers. She became one the way a great many women of her generation became one, which is to say, by widowhood and arithmetic. Her husband, Frederick Kendrick, worked for a shipping agent down near the docks for over 20 years, a steady, unremarkable man who came home smelling of tar and brine and never once, in all that time, raised his voice at her that she can recall. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1883 quickly, over the course of 9 days, leaving Augusta a house with a mortgage still owing on it and very little else besides. She was 43 years old, with one grown daughter already married and settled in New Jersey, and a choice in front of her that was really not much of a choice at all. Sell the house and take a room somewhere as a boarder, herself dependent on relatives who had their own households to think of, or keep the house and fill the rooms she no longer needed with people who could pay for them. She kept the house. Tonight, under her roof, there are 8 boarders and 1 hired girl, a 16-year-old named Bridget Doyle, who arrived from County Clare not quite 2 years ago and does the heaviest of the work, the coal hauling, and the worst of the laundry in exchange for $4 a month and her own bed in a windowless room off the kitchen. There is Mr. Edwin Halloran, 24, who clerks for a dry goods importer across the river and has occupied the 2nd floor front room for going on 3 years now. There is Miss Clara Bishop, 22, who sews for a dressmaker on Fulton Street by day and mends garments of her own by lamplight most evenings, and who has the smallest room on the top floor, tucked under the slope of the roof, because it is the cheapest, and she has never once complained about it. There is Miss Ruth Fenwick, 27, who teaches 42 children their letters and their sums in a public schoolroom not 4 blocks away. There is Mr. Bragg, Thomas Whitcomb, 33, who gives piano and voice lessons to the daughters of families slightly better off than his own, and whose instrument, rented and upright, occupies more of his room than the bed does. And there are 4 others besides, a bookkeeper named Voss, who keeps mostly to himself, a young woman named Effie Lund, who works one of the new telephone exchanges downtown, and a pair of brothers who clerk at the same insurance office and share a room to save money neither of them will admit to needing to save. Bridget's own crossing to this house is worth a moment's mention, since it is a journey a great many young women in Augusta's position had made themselves or watched their own mothers make a generation earlier. She left a farm outside Ennis with her passage paid by an older sister already settled in Brooklyn, arriving with a single trunk and a letter of introduction that got her, eventually, to Augusta's kitchen door, rather than to any of the rougher situations a girl arriving alone in this city might otherwise have found herself steered toward. She sends most of her $4 a month home across the ocean, rather than spending it, a habit common enough among girls in her position, that the shipping lines running between New York and Ireland built a good part of their steady business on precisely this kind of quiet, faithful remittance. Steady sums that quietly outlasted whatever else this decade took from families on both sides of that ocean. 9 mouths to feed, twice a day at least, sometimes 3 times, 9 sets of linens. 9 sets of expectations about what a respectable house owes the people who pay to live in it. The house itself runs 4 stories from basement kitchen to attic rooms, a narrow footprint stretched tall the way most of these brownstones were, since land in this part of Brooklyn had grown too costly by the time it was built to spread outward rather than up. A single staircase, steep and narrow past the 2nd floor, connects every level, which means every scuttle of coal, every pitcher of wash water, every trunk belonging to an arriving or departing boarder, travels the same worn treads Augusta herself climbs a dozen times a day. The parlor and dining room occupy the ground floor, the best bedrooms, the 2nd, smaller rooms the 3rd, and the smallest of all, Clara's among them, tucked beneath the roofline, where the ceiling slopes too low for a grown man to stand upright along the outer wall. It is, in its shape if nothing else, a small, vertical map of the household's own hierarchy, comfort and space diminishing, floor by floor, as the rent required to occupy each one diminishes right alongside it. Here is the part that most people miss when they picture a woman like Augusta Kendrick. They picture someone soft, someone maternal, in the gentlest possible sense, fussing over her boarders the way a mother fusses over children who happen to be paying rent. There is some truth in that picture. She does know which of her boarders takes his tea weak and which takes it nearly black. She does notice, without being told, when Miss Bishop's eyes look strained from close work, and quietly moves the lamp nearer to her at the dinner table. But underneath the softness is a woman running, in effect, a small and precarious business with a mortgage payment due on the 1st of every month, regardless of how many rooms happen to be let that month. And she has buried the arithmetic so thoroughly under good manners. She keeps a notebook. It sits on the small writing desk in her own room on the 2nd floor rear. A plain black ledger with a cracked spine, and in it she records everything a house like this requires a woman to track. Rent due dates for each boarder, staggered across the month, so the money arrives steadily rather than all at once, disappearing just as fast. The price of coal by the ton, watch the way another woman might watch the stock pages, because coal is the single largest expense this house carries after the mortgage itself. Meat, flour, milk, soap, lamp oil, each with its running price scratched in beside it, because the price of nearly everything has crept upward these last 2 years, while wages, including her boarders' wages, mostly have not. She has a private opinion, never spoken aloud in this house, that the men who run the banks and the railroads brought the hard times of last year down on the whole country through their own greed and carelessness, and that the cost of it has landed, as it always seems to, hardest on people like her who had no part whatsoever in causing it. She reads the newspaper. Her son-in-law leaves behind on his visits more carefully than most of her boarders would guess, and she has opinions about municipal politics sharp enough to surprise them. Her daughter Louisa lives across the river, and a further train ride away, in a modest house in New Jersey, with a husband who works in insurance, and 2 small children Augusta sees perhaps 6 times a year, less often than she would like, and more often, she reminds herself. A letter arrives from Louisa roughly every 2nd week, and Augusta keeps them bundled with a ribbon in the same drawer as the household ledger, an arrangement that strikes her on the rare occasions she thinks about it directly as a small joke on herself, love, and arithmetic sharing the same drawer because there was never a second drawer to spare. She writes back on Sunday evenings, the 1 hour in her week reliably free of any other claim on it, and the letters she sends are, without her quite intending it, considerably more cheerful than the week they describe, because a mother's instinct to spare a daughter worry runs deeper, it turns out, than any amount of honest exhaustion. She has one other private indulgence, smaller and entirely her own. Buried in the back pages of the newspaper her son-in-law leaves behind sits a serialized novel, published a chapter at a time across several months, a romance set among the English gentry that Augusta would be faintly embarrassed to admit she follows as faithfully as she does and reads standing at the kitchen table with her tea going cold. A few stolen minutes most afternoons before the marketing has to begin. It is not literature by any measure she would defend aloud, and she knows it, and she reads it anyway, because a woman who spends 16 hours a day managing other people's comfort is entitled, she has decided, to a small stretch of pure escape belonging to nobody but herself. Today's page in that ledger is not unusual. It is, in fact, entirely representative, which is precisely why we are spending our evening here rather than on some singular dramatic day that would tell us less about the shape of her actual life. Laundry to finish and hang before the rain makes that impossible in the yard, which means the kitchen will do instead. Strung with lines from the mantel to the dresser. A joint of mutton to stretch through careful cutting and a great deal of barley and root vegetable into a stew that will feed 9 people. And, if she manages it well, leave enough for a smaller supper tomorrow besides. The coal scuttles need refilling from the cellar bin, once today at least, because the rain has made everyone want the parlor fire built up higher than usual. And there is a new boarder expected to view the vacant 3rd floor room sometime this week, a young man recommended by Mr. Bra. Halloran from his own office, which means the room needs airing and the linens need changing in advance of a visit that may or may not come to anything. None of this is dramatic. All of it is exhausting, in the quiet, accumulating way that housework generally is. One task, finished only to reveal the next task waiting underneath it, like a stair you did not know was there. It is not yet 6 in the morning, and Augusta Kendrick has already been awake for 20 minutes. The day, such as it is, has already begun. She is standing at the kitchen range in the basement, in a wrapper and an old shawl she keeps for exactly this purpose, feeding kindling into the firebox by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The match has already been struck. The first small flames are catching against yesterday's ash, which she raked out and banked carefully the night before, so that this morning would not have to start entirely from nothing. This is a skill in itself, banking a fire so it holds its heat through 6 sleeping hours without either dying out or burning through the coal she cannot afford to burn overnight. She learned it the way she has learned everything about running this house, by getting it wrong first, by waking one bitter January morning 3 winters ago to a cold firebox and a full house expecting breakfast, and never letting that happen again. Bridget comes down a few minutes after her, rubbing sleep out of her eyes, and together they begin the call. This is the part of the day Augusta's hands remember even when the rest of her would rather forget it. The coal bin sits in the cellar, below even the kitchen, and the scuttles have to be filled there and hauled up, first to the kitchen range itself, then up one flight to the front parlor grate, which the boarders expect lit and glowing by the time they come down for breakfast, and on cold mornings like this one, up 2 more flights besides. To keep the smaller stoves in the upstairs rooms from going out entirely. A full scuttle of anthracite is heavy, heavier than it has any right to be for its size. And by the third trip up the narrow back staircase, Augusta's shoulder has begun to ache in the dull, familiar way it aches most mornings now, a soreness she has stopped mentioning to anyone. The numbers are worth pausing over because they explain a great deal about why this labor falls the way it does. A ton of coal this autumn runs somewhere near $6. And a house like this one, heating a kitchen range and a parlor grate, and contributing coal to 8 or 9 small room stoves through a Brooklyn winter, will burn through several tons before spring. That expense alone very nearly equals what one boarder pays in a full month of rent, which means the coal is not a convenience. It is close to the largest single cost of keeping this house standing and warm, and it has to be carried, literally, scuttle by scuttle, by 2 women, because there is no one else in this household whose job it is. Bridget's own wages sit at the very bottom of this whole arrangement, and they are worth naming plainly rather than passing over. $4 a month, plus her bed and her meals, for work that includes the heaviest hauling in the house, and very little else besides. Set against the pound of it, that sum sounds meager, and by any fair accounting, it was. But set against what Bridget could have earned back in County Clare, where wage labor for a young woman of her background barely existed at all, outside of service in a household that would never have paid her anything beyond her keep, the arrangement reads differently. Which is precisely why the ships crossing the Atlantic those years carried so many young women exactly like her. Augusta pays what the going rate for a hired girl actually is in Brooklyn that autumn. No more, and if she is honest with herself, very little less. And the 2 of them have settled into something that functions, most days, closer to an uneven partnership than to simple employer and servant. 2 women hauling the same coal up the same stairs. One of them simply hauling it for wages, rather than for ownership of the house at the top of them. By 6:15, the porridge is on. Oatmeal stretched with a little extra water than the recipe strictly calls for, because 9 bowls of it need to come from a pot sized for 6. Coffee is brewing, the real kind for the front table, and a weaker second pot, made from the same grounds, run through twice, for the kitchen. Bread from yesterday, sliced thick and set to toast against the top of the range, because fresh bread every morning is an expense this house cannot sustain, and day-old bread, toasted well, draws few complaints. For those boarders willing to pay the extra nickel a week for it, there are eggs, and Augusta keeps a private mental ledger of exactly who has paid for that privilege and who has not, because the arithmetic of this house runs on distinctions that fine as that. Upstairs, the house is beginning to wake in its own separate rhythm. Edwin Halloran is the first of the boarders down, as he generally is, a young man with the kind of restless energy that makes lying in bed past 6 feel to him like a small defeat. He dresses with care he would never admit to caring about, a clean collar, a coat brushed the night before, because a dry goods clerk's whole professional worth rests on looking like a man who could be trusted with somebody else's inventory and somebody else's money, and he has understood that fact since his first week on the job. He crosses the hall quietly, so as not to wake Miss Bishop through the thin wall, and comes down to a parlor fire that is, thanks to Augusta and Bridget's hour of labor already spent, properly caught and glowing by the time he settles into the chair nearest it with the newspaper. Ruth Fenwick comes down not long after, dressed plainly and sensibly in the way a schoolmistress is expected to dress, her hair pinned with a severity that has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with what a room full of 42 children will tolerate from the woman meant to command them. She eats quickly, checks the small watch pinned to her bodice twice within 5 minutes, and says little, because her morning has exactly enough slack in it to reach the schoolhouse and not 1 minute more. Clara Bishop comes last of the young women, and comes down looking, most mornings, like she has not entirely finished sleeping yet, which is close to the truth. She works piecework by lamplight most evenings, until her eyes ache, mending garments for extra pennies on top of her wages from the dressmaker's shop. And the tiredness shows in the quiet gentleness of her movements at the breakfast table, the way she holds her coffee cup with both hands as though it is the only warm thing available to her yet. Augusta has noticed this about her, the way she notices most things about her boarders without commenting on them, and quietly makes sure Clara's coffee is poured first and hottest. A small kindness that costs nothing and would embarrass Clara terribly if she ever realized it was deliberate. Now, here is where most people get the picture of a boarding house breakfast table wrong. They imagine something leisurely, a lingering half-hour of conversation over coffee before the day properly starts, the way a family breakfast might have looked in a more prosperous household. The reality inside a respectable boarding house runs considerably stricter than that. Augusta enforces house rules at that table, with a firmness her boarders would not necessarily use the word firmness to describe, because she delivers it gently. But firmness, it is all the same. Breakfast is served promptly at 6:30 and cleared by 7:15, whether every plate is finished or not, because 9 separate work schedules cannot be allowed to drift against one shared kitchen. No boarder reads a newspaper at the table beyond a first cursory glance at the headlines, a rule Augusta enforces with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a small silence, because idle lingering at a shared table when others are trying to eat and leave is, in her private accounting, a kind of theft of everyone else's morning. Conversation stays light. Money is never discussed at that table, not the boarders' wages and not the households. An unspoken rule so thoroughly absorbed by everyone under this roof that none of them could tell you when or how they learned it. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, because it tells you something the sentimental version of this story leaves out. A boarding house table looked genteel because genteel was the entire point of it. Boarders paid, in part, for the appearance of a proper household, a substitute family with proper family manners. And Augusta's enforcement of those manners was not fussiness for its own sake. It was the difference between a respectable house that could command $4 a week and a rougher one that could not. The house's other boarders keep their own quieter rhythms around the edges of this morning. Mr. Voss, the bookkeeper, who works late into most nights on ledgers of his own, does not come down until closer to 7, moving through breakfast with the economical silence of a man who has learned that conversation before his second cup of coffee is a poor use of anyone's morning, his own included. Effie Lund, who operates one of the new telephone switchboards downtown and must be at her post by 8 sharp, eats, standing half the time, coffee in one hand and a hairpin in the other. A small daily scramble that Augusta has stopped trying to slow down, since the girl manages it every single morning without once actually being late. The two insurance clerk brothers Walter and George Pruitt come down together as they do everything together, sharing a room and very nearly finishing each other's sentences. A closeness that has made them, in Augusta's private estimation, the easiest boarders under her roof, since they require almost nothing beyond each other's company and a hot breakfast to be perfectly content. By 7:15, the front hall fills with the small chaos of departure. Umbrellas retrieved from the stand by the door, most of them, since the rain shows no sign of letting up. Coats checked for missing buttons. Mr. Kai. Halloran sets off first, on foot to the trolley that will carry him toward the bridge and across the river into Manhattan, where he will spend the next 10 hours behind a high wooden counter, checking invoices against crates of imported cloth and trying very hard to look older than 24. His walk carries him first to the trolley stop and then, 20 minutes later, onto the approach of the great bridge itself, its stone towers rising out of the morning mist ahead of him like something too large to have actually been built by ordinary hands, though he has crossed it perhaps 1,000 times now. The wooden promenade running above the roadway carries foot traffic separate from the carriages and the cable cars below, and on a wet morning like this one, it fills with men exactly like him. Collars turned up, hats gripped against the wind, funneling off the river. All of them walking the same quarter-mile of swaying planking suspended far above water that the ferries used to carry them across before this bridge made the crossing a matter of feet rather than boats. He rarely thinks of it as remarkable anymore. It has simply become the walk between one part of his life and the other. Miss Fenwick follows close behind, walking the 4 blocks to her schoolhouse rather than paying trolley fare. She has decided she can do without, her umbrella tilted hard against the wind. Clara Bishop leaves last among the young women, walking toward Fulton Street and the dressmaker's shop, where she will spend her day bent over hems and darts in a room with insufficient light, thinking, more than she would admit to anyone, about the letter home she still owes her mother and has not found the evening free to write. Thomas Whitcomb does not leave with the others. His work does not properly begin until mid-morning, when the daughters of families slightly better off than his own arrive for their lessons, so he lingers a little longer over his coffee, working through scales in his head the way another man might work through a crossword, and Augusta, moving past him with an armful of dirty linen, does not begrudge him the extra quarter hour, because a house like this runs on more than one kind of clock, and she has learned to keep track of all of them at once. Whitcomb trained in his younger years for something grander than teaching scales to other people's daughters. He studied for 3 years at a conservatory in Boston, on money his own father scraped together from a modest trade, with every intention of a career on the concert stage, and he still keeps, folded flat in the bottom of his trunk, a single favorable review from a student recital he gave at 22. The closest he ever came to the kind of public recognition he once assumed would simply arrive on schedule. It did not arrive. A combination of ordinary bad luck, a talent that turned out to be solid rather than exceptional, and a father's sudden illness that pulled him home before he had properly established himself, left him instead giving lessons in other people's parlors for a modest fee, a living rather than the life he had once pictured. He does not consider himself embittered by this most days, and mostly he is telling the truth when he says so, but the review stays folded in the trunk regardless, and he has never once shown it to anyone under this roof. By 7, the front hall is quiet again. The rain has not stopped. And Augusta Kendrick, with breakfast cleared and 5 boarders gone out into the wet morning, and 4 more still moving somewhere above her, is already thinking about the wash. Let us stop here for a moment before we follow her into it, because the wash and the coal and the mutton stretched thin are all part of something larger, an entire hidden economy that decided whether a house like this one survived or went under. A boarding house in this era ran on numbers most of its own boarders never saw, and that invisibility was rather the point of it. Consider what a single room actually cost Augusta to offer. Rent for her own house, mortgage payments in this case since she inherited it outright from Frederick rather than leasing, still represented a fixed cost, regardless of how many rooms sat empty in a given month. Coal, as we have already seen, ran close to $6 a ton, and a house this size might burn 4 or 5 tons across a full winter. Food for 9 people, twice or 3 times daily, at the prices we mentioned earlier, added up to something in the neighborhood of $10 or $12 a week, if managed carefully, considerably more if it was not. Add lamp oil, soap, laundry starch, the occasional repair to a leaking pipe or a broken sash window, and a boarding housekeeper was running what amounted to a small hotel on the profit margin of a corner grocer. The mortgage itself deserves a plain accounting, since it sat underneath every other figure in Augusta's ledger. Frederick had borrowed close to $2,000 against the house when they bought it, a decade before his death, a sum that would take a working man of ordinary means the better part of a lifetime to save outright, and the monthly payment against that loan, principal and interest together, and to something near, due whether her room sat full or half empty that month. This single fixed obligation is the real reason Augusta could never simply let a room stand vacant while she found the perfect tenant. An empty room earned nothing while the mortgage kept accruing regardless, and so she learned early in her 11 years to fill a vacancy quickly and adjust her standards slightly, rather than hold out for an ideal boarder who might never come. A compromise that shaped nearly every decision she made about who slept under this roof. Against all of that stood the rent her boarders paid. $4 a week for the smallest rooms, the ones tucked under the roof like Clara Bishop's. $5.50 for a comfortable room on the second floor. $6 or more for the front rooms with the best light and the least noise from the street. Multiply that across 8 or 9 boarders, and Augusta was bringing in something in the range of $40 to $45 in a good week, against expenses that, in a hard week with coal prices up and the butcher charging more for a scarcer cut, might eat nearly all of it. The margin she actually lived on, after the mortgage and the coal and the food, and Bridget's wages, could be as thin as $5 or $6 in a week, where nothing at all went wrong. A burst pipe, an empty room sitting unlet for a fortnight, an illness that kept a boarder from paying on time. Any one of these could erase that margin entirely. This is why the meat matters so much, and why we should not read past it too quickly, as simply a detail of old-fashioned cooking. Stretching a pound and a half of stewing beef to a stew for 9 people was not thrift as a personality trait. It was survival arithmetic performed daily with barley and turnip and a heavy hand with the dumplings doing the work that more meat would otherwise have to do. Augusta knew, the way a good boarding housekeeper had to know, which butcher on the avenue marked down his unsold cuts toward the end of the day, and she timed her marketing around it, arriving late enough to catch the reduced price and early enough that the best of the marked down meat had not already gone to someone else's kitchen. Clothing tells a version of this same story from the boarder's side of the ledger. A young clerk like Edwin Halloran needed to look every single day, like a young man trusted with somebody else's merchandise, which meant a decent coat, a clean collar changed daily, even when the coat itself was worn thin at the cuffs, and boots kept blacked and presentable no matter how far he had to walk through weather, exactly like tonight. A ready-made suit of reasonable quality might run him $10 or $12, close to a week and a half of wages, and he would nurse that suit along for a year or more with careful brushing and the occasional trip to a tailor for minor repairs, because a second suit was simply not in his budget. Collars, cuffs, and shirt fronts, sold separately and detachable. Let a man rotate a small handful of clean linen against a smaller number of actual shirts, a small mercy of the era's fashion that saved working people considerably more money than it might first appear to. Clara Bishop's economics ran even tighter, and this is worth pausing over because it is precisely the kind of detail the sentimental version of this story tends to skip past. A seamstress earning $4 or $5 a week, paying $4 of it straight to Augusta for her room and board, was left with perhaps $1 for everything else her life required. Thread, needles, the occasional replacement for a worn stocking or a broken bootlace, a stamp and paper for the letter home she owed her mother, and whatever tiny sum she might manage to set aside toward some future she could not yet fully picture. This is why she mended her own garments by lamplight after a full day of sewing other people's clothes for wages. It was not diligence for its own sake. It was the only version of new clothing her budget actually allowed her. The irony sat close enough to the surface that even Clara noticed it some days. That very week, the workroom on Fulton Street had taken an order for a wedding dress, silk and imported lace, commissioned by a merchant's daughter getting married that November. A single garment that would earn Mrs. Alcott's shop more than Clara herself would see in wages across an entire quarter. Clara's own needle would touch that silk, would set some of its finest stitches, and would then return each evening to a wardrobe of 2 worn dresses, mended and remended in wool and cotton rather than anything approaching silk. She did not resent the wedding dress exactly, or the woman who would wear it. She had simply learned the way most working women of her era learned, to hold 2 facts in her hands at once without letting either one cancel out the other. That beautiful things existed in the world, and that she would go on making them for other people rather than for herself. For Augusta, none of this could ever be discussed openly, and that discretion was itself part of the economics. A respectable house depended on the appearance of gentility, holding steady, regardless of what the ledger underneath it actually showed. Boarders paying $4 a week for the cheapest room needed to feel at that dinner table indistinguishable in dignity from the boarder paying $6 for the best one. The parlor rug had to look presentable even when it was 3 years overdue for replacement. The tablecloth had to be spotless even when it had been turned and mended at the hems more than once. This performance of steady respectability, held in place over a genuinely precarious set of numbers, was arguably the single hardest skill a boarding house keeper had to master, harder in its way than the cooking or the cleaning, because it had to be sustained every single hour that a boarder's eyes might be watching. There is more to understand here about what this economy actually reveals. The boarding house sat at an odd hinge point in the economic life of this city, neither a business in the fully modern sense with clear owners and clear employees, nor a household in the older sense built around blood relation. It was something the era had improvised out of necessity, a woman's unpaid domestic labor, converted, almost by accident, into a small enterprise that kept a roof over her own head by keeping a roof over several strangers' heads as well, at a margin thin enough that one bad month could undo a decade of careful management. The wash is waiting. Let's go back to it. It is 9 in the morning, and the house on Blossom Street has settled into the strange, hollowed-out quiet it wears every weekday between breakfast and supper, a quiet that has almost nothing restful in it. Augusta has strung lines across the kitchen, from the mantel to the dresser and back again, because the yard is a lost cause, with the rain still coming down in that same patient, soaking way it has held since yesterday noon. Sheets and shirts and collars hang dripping over the range's residual heat, filling the basement with the smell of wet cotton and lye soap, and she moves between them with a basket on her hip, wringing and rehanging, her forearms red from the washboard and the cold water that never quite gets warm enough, no matter how much of the kettle she adds to the tub. This is Monday's proper work, in truth, but a wet Tuesday has pushed part of it forward, because linens left damp too long in a house this size start to smell of mildew within a day, and a boarding house that smells of mildew does not stay a respectable boarding house for long. The soap she uses, she still makes herself twice a year, rendered down from kitchen fat, saved through the preceding months, and mixed with lye, bought from the grocer, rather than leached from wood ash. The way her own mother once did it, a small modernization Augusta permits herself without much guilt, since the resulting bars scrub just as well and cost considerably less in labor than the older method. For the whitest linens, the front sheets, and the good tablecloth, she adds a pinch of bluing to the final rinse water, a habit passed down through 3 generations of women in her own family, and followed now more from inherited instinct than from any conscious decision. a small blue tint that tricks the eye into reading fabric as brighter and cleaner than plain white ever quite manages to look on its own. The heaviest pieces get run when time allows through a hand-cranked wringer bolted to the edge of the tub, sparing her wrists at least part of the twisting that ruined her own mother's hands by the age Augusta is now, though her shoulders pay a different toll for the privilege. Cranking a heavy iron handle round and round until the water runs from the fabric in a thin, steady stream. Bridget is upstairs doing the rooms, working her way, floor by floor, with a bucket and a rag, and the unhurried patience of someone still young enough not to resent it yet. Beds made with hospital corners, nobody taught her formally, but that she has absorbed simply from doing them several hundred times. Washstands emptied and refilled with fresh water from the pitcher she carries room to room. Grates cleared of yesterday's ash and laid fresh with kindling for the evening, so that whoever comes home first tonight need only touch a match to it. She works around Mr. Guide Foss, the quiet bookkeeper, who keeps unusual hours and is sometimes still asleep at this hour, after a late night with his ledgers, and around the vacant third-floor room, which needs airing today, ahead of the prospective new boarder's visit later in the week. Out in the city, the people who fill this house at supper are scattered across a dozen different rooms of their own. Edwin Halloran stands at a high wooden counter in a Manhattan dry goods house, cross-referencing a delivery of imported cotton print against an invoice that does not quite match the crate in front of him. A discrepancy of 11 yards that will cost him the better part of an hour to resolve, and possibly a sharp word from his superior, regardless of whose error it turns out to be. Ruth Fenwick stands at the front of a schoolroom 4 blocks from Blossom Street, 42 children arranged in rows in front of her, working through long division on a slate board with the controlled, unblinking patience that keeping order. Glancing occasionally toward the window, where the rain streaks the glass and makes the whole classroom feel dimmer than it should at this hour. Clara Bishop sits bent over a dressmaker's work table on Fulton Street, a length of grey wool spread across her knees, setting tiny, even stitches into a hem with a concentration that has left a faint red groove on the side of her middle finger where the needle rests hour after hour. Thomas Whitcomb, whose own working day has only just begun, sits at his rented upright piano across town, guiding the daughter of a well-to-do family through scales. She plays with more enthusiasm than accuracy, correcting her hand position gently and thinking, not for the first time, that teaching other people's children to love music is a strange, quiet way to spend a life, though not, he has decided, an unhappy one. Clara's own workroom on Fulton Street holds 11 other women bent over similar tables, needles moving at similar speed, the whole room lit by a bank of tall windows that let in plenty of grey daylight but very little actual warmth, so that even indoors most of the seamstresses keep a shawl close at hand through the colder months. The proprietress, a widow herself, named Mrs. A. Cott, who built the shop from nothing over 20 years, pays by the piece rather than by the hour, which means idle hands cost a seamstress money in a way that idle hands never quite cost a salaried clerk. And the room stays largely silent through the working day, conversation kept to a murmur so as not to slow anyone's hands. Ruth's schoolroom, by contrast, runs loud almost constantly, 42 children rarely capable of the silence a room full of seamstresses maintains by simple economic necessity, and she has learned, over 6 years teaching, to think clearly through a level of noise that would undo most adults within the hour. A skill nobody ever formally taught her, and one she is quietly, privately proud of. None of them are thinking of Blossom Street at this hour. That is rather the point of what a boarding house offers. It gives its residents somewhere to not think about, a fixed point of warmth and routine, that requires nothing further from them until they walk back through its door tonight. Back on Blossom Street, Augusta's midday has its own list, longer than most people would guess for hours that look, from the outside, entirely uneventful. There is the marketing to do, out into the rain with a basket and an umbrella, down to the butcher on the avenue whose habits she has learned as thoroughly as he has learned hers. She times her arrival for just before noon, when the morning's unsold cuts start coming down in price, and she and the butcher conduct a small, wordless negotiation. Neither of them would call a negotiation, in which he sets aside for her the leaner end of a shoulder that will stretch further in a stew than the cut you would otherwise have to pay full price for. This small daily errand, repeated 6 days a week for 11 years, has saved this household more money over that span than almost any other single habit Augusta maintains, though she has never once sat down and calculated the total, because doing so would only make explicit a kind of poverty she prefers to manage quietly. There is mending too in whatever gaps wash and the marketing leave her: a torn seam in one of the parlor curtains, a loose caster on the good armchair that squeaks when Mr. Halloran shifts his weight in it. And there is the account book itself, which she updates at the kitchen table the early afternoon with a cup of tea gone lukewarm beside her, entering the week's expenses against the week's rents. In a hand that has grown, over 11 years, steadier and more economical, fewer words per entry, as though the arithmetic itself has taught her to waste nothing. Not even ink. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely if we let it. The common assumption about a 19th century boarding house imagines the boarders as the ones whose lives were constrained, hemmed in by rules and small rooms and someone else's schedule. And they were. But the woman keeping the house lived under a constraint at least as total, simply invisible, because it wore the shape of ownership rather than tenancy. Augusta Kendrick owned this house outright, free of any landlord above her, and was, in every practical sense that mattered to her actual day, less free than any of her boarders, because none of them could walk away from their debts to her the way she could never walk away from her debts to the coal merchant, the butcher, and the bank that had once held her mortgage. Just after 1, a knock comes at the front door that is not the postman and not the butcher's delivery boy, and Augusta wiped her hands on her apron and answers it herself to find a young man on the step hat dripping, holding a card of introduction from Mr. Sacker, Halloran's own office. He has come, a full 2 days ahead of the appointment she expected, to view the vacant third-floor room, and Augusta, without any outward sign of the small irritation this unscheduled visit costs her, shows him up the stairs with the same unhurried warmth she would have shown him had the visit come exactly when planned. She points out the room's east-facing window, small stove, the freshly aired linens, answering his questions about the house rules and the supper hour with practiced ease, and by the time he leaves 20 minutes later, she has very likely secured her 9th boarder without once letting him see how much that 9th boarder's rent actually matters to a ledger he will never be shown. By 2 in the afternoon, the rain has thinned to something closer to mist, and the light through the kitchen window has gone the flat grey of a day that will not brighten further before dark. Augusta straightens from the washtub, presses a hand briefly to the small of her back, and glances at the clock on the mantel. Supper needs starting soon if it is to be ready when the first of her boarders comes home wet and tired and hungry, and there is still the stew to properly begin, the barley to measure, the vegetables to peel and dice at a kitchen table that has not this whole day sat empty for longer than the time it takes her to cross the room and back. Before we follow her further into the evening, there is something worth understanding about the rules this house runs on, because they shaped every hour of the day we have just watched, and every hour still to come. A respectable boarding house in 1894 was governed by a code of conduct nearly as detailed as any employer's, though almost none of it was written down. Augusta enforces a curfew of 10 o'clock, doors locked and gas turned low in the front hall. After that hour, not out of any harshness of temperament, but because a house with boarders coming and going at all hours quickly loses its reputation as a respectable house. And reputation was, as we discussed a little while ago, close to the whole of what she was actually selling. A boarder who wished to stay out later than 10 needed to arrange it with her in advance. A courtesy nearly everyone under this roof observed without complaint, because the alternative, finding oneself locked out on a Brooklyn street after dark, was considerably worse than the small indignity of asking permission. Gentlemen callers, for the young women in this house, were received in the front parlor and nowhere else. Miss Fenwick or Miss Bishop might sit with a caller for an hour on a Sunday afternoon, under Augusta's loose but entirely real supervision from an adjoining room, but no man beyond a woman's own father or brother ever climbed the stairs toward the private floors. This was not Augusta's personal preference imposed on her boarders. It was closer to a city-wide understanding, upheld as much by the young women themselves as by any landlady, because a single working woman's respectability in this era was a fragile enough thing that a single rumor, true or false, could cost her both her room and her position at whatever shop or schoolroom employed her. Clara Bishop understood this arithmetic as well as anyone in the house, and guarded her own reputation with a watchfulness that had nothing to do with excess propriety and everything to do with simple economic self-preservation. Drink carried its own strict rule, one Augusta enforces without exception. No spirits of any kind cross the threshold of this house, a policy common to nearly every respectable boarding house of the era, born partly of genuine temperance, conviction, and partly of hard practical experience, since a landlady's reputation could be undone overnight by a single boarder coming home loud and unsteady in front of the whole street. Augusta lost a boarder to this rule once, 3 years back, a young man let go within the week after he arrived home twice, smelling of whiskey, and she has never once regretted the decision, whatever the lost month's rent cost her, because the alternative, a house known on the block for tolerating such behavior, would have cost her considerably more in the long run than one vacant room ever could. Sunday carried its own quiet expectation. Augusta did not require church attendance in any formal sense, could not have enforced it even if she wished to. But a boarder who never once attended services on a Sunday morning would, before long, find the household's warmth toward them cooling by degrees nobody could quite point to directly. Ruth Fenwick attended a Methodist congregation 4 blocks over with a regularity that had as much to do with genuine faith as with the simple social fact that a schoolmistress's employers took a dim view of teachers who skipped it. Whitcomb attended less often, and nobody in the house remarked on it aloud, though Augusta noticed the way she noticed most things, and quietly adjusted her private estimation of him by a fraction nobody would ever see reflected in how she treated him at the table. Augusta's own Sunday, the one that had passed only 5 days before this rainy Tuesday, followed its usual pattern. Services in the morning at the same small Episcopal church she and Frederick had attended together for 2 decades, a hymnal worn soft at the corners from her own hands, a pew near the back she has occupied so consistently that the family who once sat in front of her would notice, she suspects, if she ever moved. A cold dinner at midday, since Sunday cooking stayed deliberately light out of respect for a day of rest that a boarding house keeper otherwise never truly received. And in the afternoon, the one stretch of the week when the parlor actually belonged to whoever wished to sit in it, callers received, letters written, an hour or two when the house's usual machinery of obligation eased its grip just slightly, enough that even Augusta could feel the difference. Health, in a house like this one, was a subject discussed even less openly than money, and arguably mattered more. 9 people sharing a single water closet on each floor, sharing linens laundered together in the same tub, sharing a dining table and its dishes, meant that illness moved through a boarding house with an efficiency the era only partly understood. A cold, caught by one boarder in a wet October, like this one, moved, within days, through half the household. Consumption. The disease that had taken Augusta's own husband, in a different but related form, was the quiet dread underlying every persistent cough anyone in this house developed, because a boarder who fell seriously ill faced an impossible calculation. A doctor's visit cost money most boarders could not easily spare. Missed week of wages could not be recovered. And a landlady, however kindly, could not indefinitely house a boarder who had stopped being able to pay rent, whatever her private sympathies. Augusta had, in her 11 years keeping this house, nursed 2 different boarders through serious illness at her own expense rather than see them put out onto the street, and had quietly absorbed the cost both times without ever mentioning it to anyone, including, in one case, the boarder himself. Most ordinary complaints never reached a doctor at all, because Augusta's own kitchen cabinet served as the first and often only line of treatment. Mustard plasters for a chest cold, mixed and applied with a briskness that brooked no argument from whichever boarder was suffering it. Willow bark tea for fevers and aches, brewed from a small paper packet the druggist on the avenue sold cheaply to anyone who asked. Camphor rubbed onto a sore throat, a raw onion left cut open in a stuffy room overnight on the folk conviction that it drew the illness out of the air, a remedy with no medical basis whatsoever that Augusta employs anyway, partly from her own mother's habit, and partly because it does no harm and seems to coincide reliably enough with recovery that she has never seen reason to stop. Genuine medicine, the kind practiced by an actual physician with an actual diploma, remained a last resort in a house like this one, reached for only when home remedies and simple endurance had both plainly failed. There is more to understand here about how class actually functioned inside a house like this, because it did not sort itself the way we might expect. Edwin Halloran, a clerk, earned more in a week than Clara Bishop, a seamstress, and by the strict measure of wages alone, might be considered her social superior. Yet Ruth Fenwick, a schoolteacher, earning less than Halloran but carrying the social prestige of an educated profession, was addressed by everyone in the house, including Augusta, with a shade more formal courtesy than either of them received. Rank inside a boarding house ran on a braided measure of income, occupation, and simple manner, not on any single clean hierarchy. And Augusta's genuine skill as a landlady lay partly in her ability to hold all of these braided distinctions in her head at once. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told about boarding house life. It looked, from the street, like a single undifferentiated household. From the inside, it was a small society with its own careful gradations, its own unspoken laws, its own quiet enforcement mechanisms, all of it built and maintained almost entirely by one woman who received no formal recognition for the work of holding it together, because holding it together, the way breathing was assumed to be what a person did, invisible until it stopped. Supper is not far off now, and the house is beginning to stir toward evening. It is 6 o'clock, and the heavy velvet curtains in the front parlor have already been drawn against the fog rolling in off the harbor, and against the rain that has by now been falling for the better part of a full day. Behind those curtains, the parlor holds a warmth that has been building since 4, when Augusta first built the fire up, higher than the daytime embers she keeps it at. Anthracite coal glows orange and hisses faintly in the grate. The grandfather clock against the far wall keeps its unhurried tick, a sound so constant in this room that none of the boarders consciously hear it anymore, though every one of them would notice instantly if it stopped. And from the kitchen below, rising up through the floorboards and the stairwell alike, comes the smell that has been quietly filling this house for the last 3 hours. Mutton roasting slow, cabbage boiling down soft, and underneath both of them, the sharper, warmer note of kerosene from the lamps. The front door opens and closes, at intervals of a few minutes apiece, as the boarders come home one after another out of the wet evening. Edwin Halloran first, shaking rain from his hat in the vestibule, his collar wilted from a full day, and the crossing back over the bridge in weather that never let up. Ruth Fenwick close behind him, exhausted in the specific way that comes from holding 42 children's attention for 6 straight hours, grateful beyond words for a fire already lit and a chair already warm. Clara Bishop, last of the young women, her fingers stiff from a full day of stitching, glancing gratefully toward the parlor's glow the moment she steps through the door. Each of them crosses the hall, hangs a dripping coat on the same crowded rack, and settles for a few minutes at least into the one room in this house built entirely for comfort rather than function. At 6:15, the dinner bell rings from the kitchen stairwell, and the house's evening etiquette asserts itself with a firmness that would surprise anyone picturing this scene as merely cozy. Boarders take the same seats at the long table every single night, an arrangement never formally announced but absolutely fixed. Halloran near the head where the meat is carved, Fenwick and Bishop together further down, Whitcomb at the far end near the sideboard. Augusta sits nearest the kitchen door, positioned to rise without disruption whenever a dish needs refilling or a plate needs clearing, a seating choice so practical it has become itself a kind of quiet statement about whose comfort this table actually exists to serve last. Conversation stays light and general, the weather a piece of city news, nothing that touches on money or romance or religion too directly, because Augusta's dinner table operates under the same unspoken code we discussed a little while ago, and every boarder at it has long since learned its shape without ever being told the rules outright. The stew itself arrives in a single large tureen, carried up from the kitchen by Bridget, with both hands wrapped in a cloth against the heat, and set before Augusta, to serve rather than passed boarder to boarder. Another small mechanism of control disguised as simple hospitality. The mutton has gone dark and tender after its hours of slow cooking, falling apart at the touch of a spoon rather than requiring a knife, stretched exactly as far as barley and diced turnip and carrot can stretch it, thickened further with dumplings dropped in during the stew's final half hour, filling things that expand in the stomach the way they were always intended to. The cabbage, boiled separately and served alongside, carries a faint sweetness that comes only from cooking it low and slow rather than hard and fast. A small culinary skill Augusta picked up from her own mother and has never once written down because it lives entirely in her hands rather than in any recipe book. Bread, the same-day-old loaves toasted this morning, gets a second life alongside the stew, torn and used to soak up what the spoon leaves behind. It is not an elegant meal, and nobody at this table expects it to be. It is warm, and there is enough of it, and after a full day spent elsewhere in the cold and the rain, warmth and sufficiency are doing all the work that elegance would otherwise have to do. Now, here is where most people get the boarding house dinner table wrong. They picture warmth without structure, a found family sharing a meal the way an actual family might. What that picture misses is how much deliberate management sits underneath the warmth. Augusta watches the meat as it circles the table with the vigilance of a woman who has calculated exactly how many slices a pound and a half of mutton, stretched with barley and root vegetable, into a proper stew can honestly provide, and she serves herself last and lightest, a habit so old by now that she barely notices doing it. She notices, without seeming to, whether Whitcomb's portion looks thinner than it should, and quietly corrects it on the next pass. She notices Clara's tired eyes and makes sure the lamp nearest her plate burns bright rather than low. None of this reads to the boarders as calculation. It reads simply as good keeping, which is precisely what it is meant to read as, and precisely why it works. After the plates are cleared, but before the table is properly abandoned, the parlor settles into its own small evening ritual. Whitcomb sometimes sits at the piano he does not own, but has, through simple habit, come to treat as his own instrument in this house, playing something quiet and unpretentious, rather than any of the showier pieces his students labor over, a small kindness to a room full of tired people that nobody has ever asked him for directly. Halloran reads the evening paper aloud in snatches when something in it strikes him as worth sharing. A minor scandal downtown, a shipping notice relevant to his own firm, and the others half listen while working at their own small evening tasks, a sock darned, a button resewn, a letter half composed. Some nights the paper carries more than a minor scandal. This past summer, the railroad strike out of Chicago closed down freight lines clear across the country for the better part of a fortnight. Federal troops sent in on President Cleveland's own order to break it, and the newspaper columns since have argued over what it all meant with a heat that even reaches this quiet parlor. Halloran, whose own firm depends on freight moving reliably through half a dozen states, has opinions about the strike. He shares more freely than Augustus' table rules strictly allow, and Voss, listening from his corner with his own quieter politics, occasionally offers a single dry sentence that undercuts the younger man's certainty without ever quite starting an argument outright. It is not conversation exactly, and it is not solitude either. It is the easy, companionable quiet of people who share a roof without sharing a family, filling an hour together because the alternative, an empty room upstairs before the fire has properly warmed it, holds less appeal than this borrowed, ordinary togetherness does. By 8, the parlor empties by degrees, the boarders drifting back to the parlor's edges and up toward their own rooms one at a time. And the second half of Augusta's day, the half almost nobody outside this house ever properly sees, begins in earnest. Let us stop here for a moment and talk honestly about what her evening still holds, because it is easily the least understood part of a landlady's day. Dishes for 9 people, washed and dried and put away in water that has to be reheated on a range now needed for tomorrow's breakfast preparation as well. Coal carried again up the same 3 flights she climbed before dawn this morning to bank the bedroom stoves for the coming cold night, her shoulder aching in the same worn groove. It ached in at 6 this morning, 12 hours. The front hall's brass door handle and knocker, polished tonight as they are most nights, because a dulled brass handle is the kind of small neglect a prospective boarder notices in the first 3 seconds of arriving. And Augusta has never once let this house be judged for want of 5 minutes polishing. The polish itself is nothing bought from a shop, only a paste of vinegar and salt and a little flour worked together in a chipped saucer, rubbed on with a soft rag and buffed off with a dry one until the brass throws back the hall lamp's light like something considerably more expensive than it actually is. A trick her own mother taught her, and one that costs pennies where a store-bought polish would cost considerably more. The entryway's oilcloth floor, scrubbed free of the day's mud and rain track, on her knees with a brush and a bucket at an hour when most of her boarders are already reading by lamplight or drifting toward sleep. Let us pause here, briefly, because this is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. There is a distinct kind of tiredness that comes not from any single hard task, but from the sheer, accumulated weight of many small ones performed in sequence, without pause, for 16 hours running. And it is this second kind of tiredness that defined Augusta Kendrick's evenings far more than any single dramatic hardship ever could. She does not think of herself as remarkable for enduring it. She thinks of it, when she thinks of it at all, simply as Tuesday, or Wednesday, or Thursday, each one indistinguishable from the last in its shape, though never quite in its texture. A rhythm so total it has become close to invisible, even to the woman living inside it. Before bed, at the kitchen table again with the black ledger open in front of her, she runs the day's numbers once more by lamplight. Rent collected from 2 boarders today, entered in her narrow economical hand. The butcher's marked down shoulder, weighed and priced. Coal remaining in the cellar bin, estimated by eye, and noted for reordering before the week is out. It takes her perhaps 15 minutes, and it is, in its quiet way, the closest thing to rest her evening. Actually offers her a small window, in which the only demand on her is arithmetic rather than physical labor. Upstairs, in the smallest room on the top floor, under the slope of the roof, where the ceiling meets the wall at an angle too low for a tall man to stand upright, Clara Bishop's evening looks entirely different and considerably quieter. Her room holds a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped china pitcher and basin, a single straight-back chair, and wallpaper patterned with small faded roses that were, presumably, cheerful once, before a decade of gas fumes and coal smoke dulled them toward the color of weak tea. A miniature iron stove, barely larger than a large cooking pot, holds a small coal fire that warms the room only partially, enough to keep the worst of the chill off rather than to make the room properly warm, and Clara has learned to sit close to it, a wool shawl over her shoulders, while she works. Tonight, as most nights, she is mending, this time a blouse of her own, with a seam that gave way at the shoulder, sometime this past week. The kerosene lamp on the small table beside her throws a soft amber circle of light, just wide enough to sew by, and outside her single window, the rain continues its steady percussion against the glass, a sound she has come to find oddly almost restful. A reminder that the discomfort of the weather belongs entirely to the street outside and not to this small room she has made, in whatever limited way the rent allows her, her own. Beside her sewing basket sits a half-finished letter to her mother in Pennsylvania, 3 lines written 2 nights ago and not yet continued, because the evenings never quite stretch far enough to hold both the mending and the correspondence in the same sitting. When she does return to it, later tonight if her eyes hold out, she will dip her steel nib into the small bottle of iron galling she keeps on the table and press careful, economical sentences onto coarse, cheap paper, describing a life considerably smaller in its comforts and considerably larger in its independence than anything her mother back home would recognize as a woman's proper situation. A soft knock comes at her door sometime past 8, and it is Ruth Fenwick, holding 2 cups of tea made on the small spirit lamp she keeps for exactly this purpose. An evening ritual the 2 women have fallen into perhaps twice a week without ever formally arranging it. They sit together for 20 minutes, Clara still stitching, Ruth resting her stocking feet near the little stove, talking about nothing especially important. A shop window Clara passed today, a stubborn arithmetic student of Ruth's. It is a small, unremarkable half-hour, and it is also, quietly, one of the only pieces of this entire day that belongs to nobody's ledger and nobody's schedule but their own. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely if you let it. The loneliness we tend to imagine into a small rented room under somebody else's roof was real enough, some nights more than others. but it existed alongside something else. This arrangement also made possible an ordinary, unremarkable companionship between two women who had no family within reach of the city and had built, almost without noticing they were building it. Let us step back for a moment from this particular evening and look at something larger, moving underneath it. Because the house on Blossom Street, comfortable and unremarkable as it feels tonight, was actually sitting on top of a genuine hinge point in the history of American city life. And its residents were living through the early years of a change none of them could yet see the shape of. The plain fact worth pausing over is this. The 1890 census, taken just 4 years before tonight, counted something in the neighborhood of 4 million women earning wages outside their own homes across the country. A great many of them, like Clara and Ruth, unmarried and living apart from their families. This was not a small shift. For generations before this one, an unmarried woman leaving her family home meant one of a very short list of things: marriage into another household, service in someone else's household, or a convent in the parts of the country where that final option existed at all. The idea of a respectable young woman renting her own room, answerable to no father or husband, supporting herself entirely on her own wages, was still novel enough in 1894 that magazines and ministers alike wrote about it as though it were a genuinely open question. The boarding house is precisely the institution that made this possible, which is a truth easy to miss because we tend to picture boarding houses as background scenery for other stories, rather than as the actual mechanism enabling a new kind of life. Without a respectable place to live that did not require family connection, the young single women filling America's booming cities to work in its shops and its schoolrooms and its garment trades would have had quite simply nowhere to go. A woman like Clara Bishop needed somewhere that offered the appearance and the genuine substance of chaperonage and respectability, at a price her wages could actually stretch to cover, and Augusta Kendrick's house, multiplied by many thousands of houses just like it across every American city of any size, was the answer this particular era improvised for that particular need. It did not stay the answer forever, and this is worth understanding, because it tells us something about the direction this world was already quietly leaning. In the very years we are describing, a newer institution was beginning to compete with a traditional boarding house for exactly this population of young, self-supporting women. The Young Women's Christian Association, working in cities across the country since not long after the war between the states, had begun opening dedicated residences built specifically to house working women, offering rooms not so different from the one Clara occupies tonight. With shared parlors, modest cafeterias, and a mission explicitly built around protecting and housing exactly the kind of young woman who filled Augusta's top floor. These residences were still relatively few in 1894, but their numbers would grow steadily over the coming decades, and they represented an early institutional answer to a need the individual boarding house had been meeting, until now almost entirely through the improvised labor of women like Augusta. Not far from Blossom Street in Manhattan and in cities like Chicago, a related idea was taking root under a different name. The settlement house movement, only a handful of years old in 1894, had begun placing educated young women directly into poor neighborhoods to live communally and offer practical support, literacy classes, childcare, medical advice to their immigrant neighbors. An experiment in shared living that owed something to the boarding house model even as it pushed well past it, organized around social reform rather than simple rent. Ruth Fenwick has read about these houses in the same newspapers that carry news of the railroad strike, and privately entertains, on her more restless evenings, the notion that a life spent in one of them might suit her better than a lifetime of grading arithmetic slates, though she has said this ambition aloud to exactly nobody, not even Clara. The over their shared tea. There is more to understand here about what else was stirring beneath the surface this ordinary autumn evening. Just the year before tonight, in 1893, the state of Colorado had extended the vote to women, joining the territory of Wyoming, which had done the same a quarter century earlier and carried the practice into statehood in 1890. These were still isolated victories, confined to a handful of western states and territories, and the vote would not reach women nationally for another generation past tonight. But the conversation had genuinely begun in earnest, argued over in newspapers. Ruth Fenwick reads with more attention than she generally lets on at the dinner table, and debated from pulpits and lecture halls in nearly every city in the country, including, on occasion, one not far from Blossom Street. Ruth herself holds an opinion on the matter she has learned, through some hard experience, not to raise at Augusta's table, where such subjects sit alongside money and romance on the short list of things a respectable house does not discuss over supper. The garment trades, where Clara earns her modest wage, were shifting as well, more slowly and more painfully than the suffrage question, but shifting all the same. Needle trades, workers in cities not far from this one, had already begun organizing into early unions through this decade, pushing, with only occasional success so far, against wages and working hours that had changed very little in the preceding 20 years. Clara herself belongs to no union and has only a vague sense of these efforts, gathered mostly second-hand from a fellow seamstress at the dressmaker's shop who speaks of such things in a low voice during the lunch hour. The wider transformation these early efforts were reaching toward, shorter days, steadier wages, some measure of protection against a bad month costing a worker her position entirely, remained in the autumn of 1894, still mostly a hope rather than a fact. For Augusta herself, the changes moving beneath her feet were quieter still, but no less real. The boarding house she has kept for 11 years belongs in the fullest sense to an era already beginning to close around her, without her quite noticing it closing. Within another generation, the purpose-built apartment house, the kind with its own small kitchen in every unit rather than one shared kitchen serving the whole building, would begin drawing away exactly the boarders who fill houses like this one, offering a version of urban living that required no landlady's daily oversight at all, no shared dining table, no house rules enforced over supper. Augusta cannot see this coming, not clearly, though she has noticed without quite articulating it to herself, that newer buildings going up 2 streets over seem to be built along different lines than her own home, smaller kitchens tucked into each unit. She has no way yet of knowing that the entire institution she has spent 11 years mastering the boarding house, as the standard answer to how a city houses its unmarried working population, has perhaps another generation left in it before it becomes itself a thing people remember rather than a thing people live inside. None of this touches the evening any way its residents could name directly. Clara does not think of herself as living through a hinge point in the history of American women's independence. She thinks of herself as tired and slightly behind on a letter to her mother, and grateful for a cup of tea shared with a friend down the hall. But we, looking back across a distance of more than a century, can see what she cannot, that her small rented room under a sloped roof on Blossom Street sat at the exact center of one of the quieter revolutions of her era, a revolution that arrived not through marches or manifestos, but through several million individual women, one modest rented room at a time, learning that a life supported entirely on one's own wages was, however precarious, actually possible. The house has gone fully quiet around this thought now. We will return to it and to the hours still left before its residents sleep. It is 9 o'clock, and the parlor fire has burned down to a steady bed of coals rather than the bright blaze it was at 6. Whitcomb has gone up to his room with a book he will read for perhaps 20 minutes before sleep takes him. Halloran sits a while longer by the fire's last warmth, going over a small pocket ledger of his own, tracking in his own modest way the same kind of careful arithmetic that governs every floor of this house, from the cellar, coal bin to the top floor, rented rooms. Augusta moves through the ground floor a final time before her own bed, checking the front door's bolt, lowering the gas in the front hall to the barest blue flicker it will hold overnight, and pausing briefly in the doorway of her own darkened parlor to look at the room exactly as a prospective boarder might look at it. Out of 11 years of habit, that nothing in it has slipped from the standard she has spent so long maintaining. Before we follow this house the rest of the way into sleep, it is worth stepping back from tonight entirely and asking what a single evening like this one actually shows us once we stop watching the individual hours. The first pattern worth naming is the sheer invisibility of the labor holding this house together. Across 16 hours we have watched Augusta Kendrick light fires, haul coal 3 flights at a stretch, wash and mend and market and cook and calculate, and at almost no point in that entire day did any of her boarders witness the effort behind the results they simply enjoyed. They came down to a lit parlor fire without watching it laid. They ate a stretched, careful stew without tasting the arithmetic behind it. They slept under stoves, quietly banked by hands that had already carried coal up those same stairs twice already that day. This is not a peculiarity of one particular household. It is close to a universal feature of domestic labor in this era, and in most eras since, that its success is measured by how completely it disappears from the notice of the people it serves. Meal on time, a fire already lit, a house that simply works. These were the actual products Augusta sold, and their very smoothness was the reason nobody but Augusta herself ever had to think about what producing them cost her. The second pattern is the elaborate performance of respectability that ran underneath nearly every hour we watched, and how much genuine precarity that performance was built to conceal. The dinner table's fixed seats and light conversation, the curfew observed without complaint, the careful avoidance of money and romance as topics at supper, none of this was incidental decoration on top of the real business of housing and feeding 9 people. It was, in a very real sense, the actual product this house was selling, every bit as much as the meals themselves. A boarding house that let its gentility slip, even slightly, lost boarders to houses that had not, and so Augusta maintained an appearance of comfortable stability, sitting directly on top of a financial margin thin enough that one hard month could have undone it. The polish on the brass door handle and the actual health of the household ledger were, in the end, defending the exact same thing. A third pattern, quieter than the first 2, but no less real, is the gap this house reveals between what its young women were plainly capable of and what the social codes of their moment permitted them to do openly. Clara Bishop supports herself entirely on her own labor, manages her own modest budget, corresponds with her family as an independent adult, and mends her own clothing by lamplight with a competence no one in this house would think to question. And yet, the same young woman receives a gentleman caller only under supervision in a single approved room because her respectability, and with it her entire livelihood, rests on a fragility that has nothing to do with her actual character and everything to do with the world's willingness to imagine a woman like her as vulnerable, regardless of how capable she has already proven herself to be. The capability was real. The permission lagged well behind it and would keep lagging behind it for a good while yet. A fourth pattern, worth naming, is how thoroughly this house mediated relationships that, in an earlier generation, would simply have run through blood family instead. Ruth and Clara's shared tea in a small room under the roof functions for both of them, very much like the relationship of sisters, except that it exists entirely because a landlady rented them adjoining rooms, rather than because any family connected them. Augusta herself stands in a role that borrows heavily from motherhood, noticing tired eyes and pouring the hottest coffee first, without ever actually being anyone's mother in this house. The boarding house, in other words, was quietly inventing a new grammar for family life, built out of proximity and rent rather than blood, at exactly the moment when the country cities were filling with people who had left their blood relations behind in search of work. And the last pattern, perhaps the one that ties the others together, is simply the density of obligation running through every single hour we watched, for every person under this roof, regardless of their place in its rough hierarchy. Augusta's day held obligation from before dawn until after the rest of the house was asleep, but so did Ruth's, holding 42 children's attention for 6 hours running. So did Clara's, bent over a hem by day, and her own mending by night. Even Whitcomb, whose day looked leisurely by comparison, carried the quiet obligation of performing patience and encouragement for other people's children hour after hour, whether or not he felt either on a given afternoon. This was a world with very little room in it for anyone's day to simply be their own, and the boarding house, for all its warmth, was one more structure built to keep that density of obligation running smoothly rather than to relieve anyone of it. There is a sixth pattern worth naming before we let this day go quieter than the others, but present in nearly everything we watched. Almost none of the real skill on display across this evening carried any formal name or certificate behind it. Augusta's mastery of household economics, timing a butcher's mark down to the hour, stretching a fixed sum of coal across an entire winter, reading a boarder's mood well enough to know whose portion needed quietly enlarging, would have qualified in any other setting as genuine expertise worth a title and a salary to match. Clara's needlework carried a precision that a wealthier household would have paid handsomely for. None of it was ever called expertise because the people demonstrating it were women, and the domestic sphere they demonstrated it within had no mechanism in 1894 for converting that kind of competence into recognition. The skill was entirely real. The credit for it simply never followed the skill home. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one house on one wet October evening. They describe a whole way that a city figured out, without ever quite deciding to, how to hold together the lives of people it had pulled away from their families and set down alone in rented rooms, expecting them to build something that functioned like a life anyway. It mostly worked. It worked because women like Augusta Kendrick made it work at a cost to themselves that the era had no real language for naming. And it worked because young women like Clara Bishop and Ruth Fenwick were, in fact, exactly as capable as their circumstances quietly proved them to be, whatever their circumstances were willing to say about it out loud. That is the shape of the whole day, seen from a distance. We should come back down now, out of the pattern, and into the night itself, because the house is not quite finished with us yet. It is 9:45, and the rain outside has softened into something closer to a mist than a downpour, though it shows no sign of stopping altogether before morning. One by one, up and down the stairs of the house on Blossom Street, the small rituals of ending the day are beginning, each boarder closing their own evening in whatever manner suits them, none of them aware of quite how alike their separate rituals actually are. Edwin Halloran is the last to leave the parlor fire, banking it himself out of a habit he picked up from his own father, a small courtesy Augusta has never asked of him and never once mentioned that she noticed. He climbs to his second-floor room, hangs his coat with the same care he gave it this morning, and sits for a few minutes at the narrow desk beneath his window, adding a line or two to the pocket ledger he keeps of his own modest savings, a sum he is building, slowly and privately, towards some version of independence he has not yet decided the shape of. He blows out his lamp a little before 10, and the last thing he hears before sleep is the rain against the glass, softer now than it has been all day. Ruth Fenwick sits up slightly longer, grading a stack of arithmetic slates by the light of her own lamp, her red pen moving down each column with the brisk, practiced patience of a woman who has done this every single weeknight for 6 years running. She allows herself, once the slates are finished, 10 pages of a novel she keeps hidden inside a plainer-looking book cover. Small vanity she would never admit to her fellow boarders, and which Augusta, who has glimpsed the arrangement more than once while delivering fresh linens. The lamp goes out a little after 10. The rain continues. Thomas Whitcomb undresses to the sound of his own private humming, some fragment of a piece one of his students mangled that afternoon, and that he cannot quite stop turning over in his head, the way a tune sometimes simply refuses to let a person alone until morning. He has no instrument in his own small room, only a folding chair and a narrow bed and a framed photograph of parents long since gone, and he lies in the dark for a while working through the piece silently in his mind before sleep finally takes the sound away from him. Mr. Voss works another half-hour past everyone else by the light of a single candle, a private habit none of his fellow boarders have ever fully understood, closing his own small ledger of personal accounts with the same exactness he brings to his employer's books all day, a man for whom order itself seems to be the closest thing to comfort he allows himself. Effie Lund falls asleep almost the moment her head meets the pillow, worn through by a day of switchboard cords and clipped instructions, her stockings still drying on the small rack beside her washstand. The Pruitt brothers, Walter and George, talk quietly across the dark of their shared room for a few minutes after their own lamp goes out. The low, companionable murmur of two people who have shared every room they have ever slept in since childhood. Before that murmur, too, fades into breathing and then into sleep. Up under the slope of the roof, Clara Bishop sets aside her mending at last, the seam finally closed, and blows out the small kerosene lamp that has lit her whole evening. In the dark, she can just make out the shape of her window, rain still tracing its slow lines down the glass. And she thinks, as she often does, at exactly this hour, of the letter still not finished on the little table beside her, and promises herself, as she often does, that tomorrow evening will hold enough time for it. It generally does not. She sleeps anyway, without much difficulty, the playing fatigue of her day proving, most nights, stronger than any small unfinished worry. Down in her own small room off the kitchen, Bridget Doyle sleeps already, and has, for the better part of an hour, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone whose whole body has spent 16 hours in honest motion. Only one person in this house is still awake, and it was at 5:30 this morning, Augusta Kendrick. She makes her final rounds a little after 10, moving quietly down through a house gone almost entirely dark, checking each landing out of a habit so old it no longer feels like checking at all. In the kitchen, she rakes the coals of the range down carefully, banking them under a thin blanket of ash, exactly as she will need them banked, to hold their heat through the night and still catch quickly for tomorrow's fire. She checks that the water barrel is filled for the morning wash, sets the porridge oats to soak so tomorrow's breakfast begins a step ahead of where today's did, and stands for a moment in the quiet of her own kitchen, the last working room in the house to finally go still. Before she climbs the stairs to her own bed, she allows herself one small private ritual, unremote to any boarder in 11 years of keeping this house. On the mantel of her own bedroom sits a small daguerreotype of Frederick, taken not long after their wedding, his collar stiff and his expression serious in the manner all such portraits demanded of a person at that time. And Augusta touches its frame lightly on her way past, most nights. Not from any lingering grief, so sharp it still catches at her, but from something gentler and more settled than grief. A kind of ordinary acknowledgement between two people who built a life together, one of whom happens to still be doing the work of it alone. Her notebook waits open on the small writing desk, and by the light of a single candle, she enters the last few lines the day requires. Tonight's supper, its cost tallied against the rent collected. Coal remaining in the cellar, a little lower than she would like, with a full month of autumn still ahead of it. And beneath tonight's entry, in the same economical hand, tomorrow's list already half written, because a house like this one never actually finishes a day, so much as it hands the unfinished parts of it forward. Laundry to collect from the line strung across the kitchen, the wash to properly begin, Monday's work pushed forward by the rain. A letter to answer from Louisa, if the evening allows it, which it likely will not. The new boarder's room to prepare in earnest, now that his visit has all but settled the matter. Tomorrow is already, in its rough outline, a day very much like today, and the day after that will very likely resemble it further still. And there is something in this repetition that a person might expect to find wearing, and does, most days, and yet somehow does not entirely, because a life built out of the same careful motions, forborne with the same quiet competence, day after day, accumulates into something that starts to look, from enough distance, very much like a life well kept. She blows out the candle a little before 11. The house holds 9 sleeping people and one who has, at last, joined them. Outside, Blossom Street has gone almost entirely dark. The gas lamps at the corners still burn, but low now, turned down by the lamplighter in his final round of the night to the barest blue flicker that will hold until dawn without wasting fuel on a street that no longer has anyone awake to walk it. The rain has settled into a soft, steady patter against slate roofs and cobblestones. No longer the driving downpour of the afternoon, just a quiet, continuous sound that seems, if anything, to deepen the silence it falls into rather than break it. Somewhere, several streets over, a lone, hansom cab makes its way home, the horse's hooves striking a slow, even rhythm against wet stone, fading gradually, until the street holds nothing but the rain and the occasional creak of a shutter worked loose by the wind. Every window along the row is dark now, one brownstone front after another settled into the same collective hush. 9 mouths fed and 9 bodies washed and 9 sets of linens changed and 9 fires banked for the night, repeated up and down this block and the next and the one after that, across a whole city of boarding houses doing, tonight, precisely what Augusta Kendrick's house has done, each one run by some version of a woman like her, each one holding some version of a Clara and a Ruth and an Edwin and a Thomas, each one invisible to the others and yet somehow, taken together, holding up an entire city's worth of young people who had nowhere else in the world to lay their heads tonight. Further off, past the quiet residential blocks, the city itself has not gone entirely to sleep, and never quite does. A late freight train works its way along the waterfront tracks, its whistle carrying faint and long across the wet air. The bridge towers stand lit against the low clouds. Few last carriages still crossing toward homes on either side of the river. But none of that reaches Blossom Street tonight, not really. Not past the muffling effect of rain and distance and the late hour, and the house we have spent this whole evening inside sits, for all practical purposes, entirely alone with its own small, quiet 9 lives and one exhausted, contented landlady folded into sleep beneath a roof that will, in 6 hours, begin asking every single thing of them again, There is a strange comfort in that fact if you sit with it a while rather than hurrying past it. Tomorrow's list is already written, half of it, in a black ledger, on a writing desk, 2 floors above where Bridget sleeps and 1 floor below where Clara does. The coal is already banked to catch again at dawn. The oats are already soaking for a breakfast that has not yet been cooked. In a very real sense, tomorrow has already begun tonight, quietly, in the small preparations of a woman too tired to notice she was doing anything remarkable by making them. The day does not truly end so much as it folds itself over, one evening's leftover task becoming tomorrow morning's opening ones, in a rhythm so continuous that trying to locate the precise scene between one day and the next starts to feel, the longer you look for it, like trying to find the seam between one wave and another in the same tide. This is, in the end, close to the truest thing this evening has to tell us. A boarding house on a wet Brooklyn street in 1894 was never really about the wallpaper or the gaslight or the grandfather clock keeping unhurried time in a parlor nobody quite relaxed in, charming as all of that remains from this distance. It was about a woman who turned her own exhaustion into other people's shelter, quietly, without ceremony, for 11 years running, and about a handful of young people who turned their own loneliness into something that functioned, most nights, very much like family, simply because the alternative, true isolation in a city of nearly 1 million strangers, was worse than the small compromises a shared roof required of them. None of them thought of themselves as remarkable while they were living it. They thought of themselves mostly as tired and slightly behind on something, and grateful, in whatever quiet way the day allowed, for a warm room at the end of it. Perhaps that sounds, in its own way, a little familiar to you as well, wherever and whenever you happen to be listening to this. The specific shape of it has changed a great deal since 1894. The general shape of it, the tiredness, the small unfinished tasks carried forward into tomorrow, the quiet gratitude for a warm room at the end of a long day, has perhaps not changed nearly as much as we sometimes assume it has. We have been in this house together for a good while now, friend, and I think it is time to let it rest, and to let you rest along with it. If you found something in Augusta Kendrick's evening worth having, in Clara's small room under the roof, or Ruth's stack of graded slates, or the hush of a street with its gas lamps turned down low, I hope you will come back and sit by this fire again another night. There are a great many more evenings like this one waiting to be told, and I would be glad of the company. The coals in the parlor grate have burned down now to their last quiet glow. The story is finished for tonight. But the people in it were real in the sense that matters most, which is that people very much like them lived exactly this kind of evening. Thousands of times over, in houses very much like this one, and you have spent the last little while somewhere inside that world rather than simply reading about it from the outside. That is not a small thing to have done with an evening. Rest well, friend. The rain will keep falling on Blossom Street long after we have gone, and the house will still be standing there in the morning, exactly as it always has been, ready to begin again.